Montana Territory, February 1878. The wind screamed across the plains like it had a grudge, and Jackson McAllister had just about enough of it. He pulled his duster tighter around him, jaw clenched, watching the snow whip past the mouth of his sod-roofed cabin. The stove inside was nearly out, and he had not slept warm in 3 nights. He had not meant to pass through this winter unmarried. But the last time he had tried trusting a woman, she left him with nothing but a broken fence and an empty barn. Since then, he preferred the cold over company. That was until Winona Sutton showed up with 2 half-frozen children and a rifle across her back. He had been chopping firewood when he saw her coat too thin, hair stuck to her face with ice, a boy and girl clinging to her sides. She looked like she had not eaten in days, and still, she stood tall. "Are you Jackson McAllister?" she called out, voice rough but steady. "I am," he said, setting the axe down. She stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. "I need help," he nodded once, stepping aside. "Come in." Inside, the fire barely flickered. Jackson tossed in the last of his kindling and turned to them. The boy was maybe 7, the girl younger, both pale with cold. Winona dropped her rifle by the door and knelt beside them. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, taking off her gloves. Her hands were red and raw. "I just need to get them warm. We were left behind. I do not plan to stay." Jackson grabbed the kettle and poured the last of his water into it, setting it on the stove. "You will stay." She glanced at him, uncertain. "You are not going back out there with those children." Winona lowered her eyes. "Their names are Ellie and Emma." Jackson crouched down, meeting their eyes. "You too hungry?" They nodded slowly. "I have beans and bread," he said, rising. Winona's hands trembled as she helped Emma remove her coat. "We were with a wagon train out of Nebraska. A man was meant to take us to Helena, said he had work for me. When the snow hit, he left us in a canyon with nothing but a blanket and a lie." Jackson's jaw tensed. He ladled warm beans into metal bowls. "And your husband?" "I never had one." Her voice was quiet. "Ellie and Emma are not mine by blood. Their mother was a friend. She died 2 weeks ago. I promised to get them safe." He stared at her. "You are out here in February on foot with 2 children that are not yours." She nodded, chin high. He handed her a bowl. "You are either braver than most or foolish." "I am both," she said, taking it. That night, Jackson gave them the bed and slept on the floor near the stove. But he did not sleep much. He kept listening to the snow, to the children breathing, to the way Winona whispered comfort to them in the dark. By the next morning, the storm had buried the front steps. Jackson spent most of the day digging them out while Winona mended one of the children's torn socks by the fire. She did not speak much, but when she did, her words were measured and clear. She had a kind of stillness in her that he had not seen in years. On the 3rd night, Jackson woke coughing. Smoke coiled in the cabin, the stove pipe clogged with ice. He threw on his coat and grabbed the poker, jabbing it up the pipe until the smoke cleared. When he came back in, Winona was standing barefoot on the floorboards, holding Emma. "I did not want to wake you," she said. He crossed to her. "You should have." She looked up at him, eyes tired, mouth trembling. "I do not know how long we can stay here. I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," he said, her voice dropped. "You sleep cold every night, Jackson, I see it." He blinked. She lifted her chin. "You can have me or keep sleeping cold." He stared at her for a long time, heart thudding in his chest. "I do not take what is not freely given," he said. "I am giving it," she whispered. He stepped closer, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Do you mean it?" Winona nodded, eyes never leaving his. "I would rather be yours than alone in the dark again." He kissed her then, slow and careful, one hand at her waist. She leaned into him like she had been waiting for it all her life. And he knew in that moment that the cold he had wrapped around himself for years was already gone. By morning, the cabin felt warmer than it ever had. Emma curled up beside Winona near the fire, and Ellie helped Jackson feed the horses. When the boy dropped the hay fork, Jackson ruffled his hair and said, "You will get it next time." Later, as the sun broke through the clouds and glinted off the snow, Winona stepped out onto the porch. Her shawl was wrapped tight and her cheeks were pink with cold. Jackson joined her, setting a hand on her back. "I never meant to marry," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "Neither did I. But I reckon I do not want to face another winter without you." Winona smiled, leaning into his side. "Then we will face it together." And for the first time in years, Jackson McAllister looked out over the winter plains and saw spring coming. The thaw began slow, like a reluctant apology. By the first week of March, the snow had hardened into crusted drifts, and the creek at the edge of Jackson's property whispered beneath a skin of ice. The morning sun stretched longer now, pale but steady, and the horses nosed through the hay without shivering. Inside the cabin, Winona was patching the elbow of a flannel shirt that had seen too many winters. Her stitches were even, the thread pulled tight. Emma sat near the hearth, pressing dried flowers into a book she had found on the shelf, an almanac from '72 that Jackson hadn't opened in years. Ellie was outside helping to haul water from the well, boots too big and determination written clear in the set of his shoulders. Jackson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You do that like you were born with a needle in hand." Winona didn't look up. "My mother had 6 children and no patience for torn sleeves. I learned fast." He stepped closer, watching her fingers work. "You miss them." "I miss the ones that lived long enough to leave." Her tone held no bitterness, just the softened edge of memory. "The rest are buried in Arkansas soil." Jackson didn't ask more. He fetched the kettle instead and set it on the stove to warm. The silence between them wasn't the kind that Preston breathed, like a space carved for 2 people who didn't need to fill every quiet with sound. After supper, Jackson brought in a bundle of rabbit pelts he'd stretched and dried. He set them on the table beside her sewing. "Thought maybe you could use these," he said. "They're soft enough to line that coat of yours." She ran her hand over the fur, then looked up at him. "You trap when I have to," he shrugged. "Mostly I raise stock, but winters like this you learn to make do." Winona studied him for a moment. "You always live alone," he hesitated. "Since I came west. Before that I had a brother in Missouri. He died in '68. After that I figured I'd had enough of depending on folks." She nodded slowly. "I understand that." That night, after the children were asleep, Winona sat by the window with her shawl drawn around her shoulders. She didn't speak, just watched the moonlight stretch across the snow. Jackson poured 2 tin cups of warmed cider and handed one to her. He settled into the chair beside hers. "You think you'll still head for Helena?" She took a sip, eyes on the horizon. "Not if there's something better here." He looked at her, the firelight catching the edge of her cheekbone. "You mean that? I wouldn't offer myself to a man I didn't trust," she said, quiet but firm. "I've had enough of men who look at me and see what they can take." Jackson swallowed, the cider thick in his throat. "I ain't like that. I know." She reached over and rested her hand on his knee. "That's why I'm still here." The air between them shifted, the kind of shift that didn't need to be named. He took her hand, calloused fingers closing over hers. "I've got land," he said. "It's not much, but it's mine. The barn needs work and the roof leaks near the east corner. But there's room to grow things." Winona's eyes softened. "I know how to plant. I know how to butcher and smoke. I can teach Emma her letters and keep Ellie from breaking his neck." He chuckled, low and warm. "Then I reckon you'd make a fine partner." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of her trust heavier than any promise. I don't want a wedding dress or a preacher. I just want a place to belong. You've got one, he said. Right here. They stayed like that until the fire died down, the room dimming around them. Outside, the wind had settled, and the night held its breath like it knew something good had begun. In the morning, Jackson rose early to split more wood. When he returned, he found Winona outside, hanging linens on a rope between two aspen poles. The children were laughing somewhere near the shed, their voices light and unburdened. He walked up behind her, rested his hand at the small of her back. "Looks like you've made yourself at home." She turned, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough. "That's because I have." And just like that, what had started as survival turned into something steadier, something that could be built on if they were willing to keep choosing it. Every morning, every storm, every spring, they both were. By late March, the snow had thinned to patchy veins across the prairie, and the ground beneath it was waking. Mud clung thick to wagon wheels and boot soles, but it smelled of thaw and life. Jackson stood by the split-rail fence near the southern slope, watching the cattle stir lazily in the field. The morning sun warmed his shoulders, and he could hear Ellie inside the barn, humming off-key while sweeping out the stalls. Winona came from the chicken coop with a basket on her hip, a faint line of straw clinging to her skirt. Her scarf was tied low against the wind, and her cheeks were flushed from the walk. She met him at the fence, setting the basket down, and pulled off her gloves one finger at a time. "You've got a heifer close to calving," she said. "The red one with the torn ear. She's restless." Jackson shifted his weight. "She's 2 weeks early. I'll keep her in the shed tonight." Winona brushed her sleeve clean. "You'll need someone to hold her steady if she calves hard." "I was thinking that." He glanced sideways. "You up to it?" Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I've helped deliver worse." They stood quiet a moment, watching the sway of the herd and the low clouds moving east. Wind rippled through the cottonwoods near the creek, and a hawk circled high above. "You ever think about leaving the territory?" she asked. "I tried once. Went as far as Wyoming before I turned back. Didn't see much point in going where I wasn't known." She looked down at her gloves. "I used to think about California. Ocean, sun, all that. Made it as far as Kansas before I got turned around by need." Jackson nodded. "You regret it?" "No." She met his eyes. "I think I was always meant to end up somewhere I could hold still." He reached for her hand, rough fingers wrapping around hers. "Then you're in the right place." Inside the cabin, Emma was kneeling by the hearth, arranging green sprigs in a tin cup, some early shoots Winona had found near the creek bank. The girl looked up as they stepped in. "Miss Winona says they'll grow better if we talk to them," she said. Jackson hung his hat on the peg. "Then talk soft. Things grow better in peace." Later that afternoon, Jackson hitched the wagon and took Ellie with him to the nearest neighbor, a homesteader named Clara Morse 3 miles east, to trade for seed potatoes. The road was still half frozen, and the ruts jostled the boy against the sideboards, but he didn't complain. He held the reins when Jackson unloaded the sacks, his grip too tight but steady. Clara handed over a wrapped cloth bundle as they loaded the last of the burlap sacks. "Tell your woman I included some onion starts. She's got the look of someone who won't waste them." "She won't," Jackson said, tying the sack down. "Thank you." On the ride back, Ellie asked, "Will we plant them right away?" "When the ground softens another inch," Jackson said. "Then we'll all dig together. Even Emma, especially Emma. She's got the smallest hands for setting roots." Back at the cabin, dusk was folding in. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, and the scent of venison stew drifted from the open window. When Jackson stepped inside, he found Emma asleep near the stove, her thumb tucked under her chin, a blanket drawn up to her ears. Winona was stirring the pot, hair pinned up in a way that left her neck bare. She glanced over her shoulder. "You get the potatoes and some onion starts." From Clara Morse. Winona ladled stew into bowls. "That woman's got the sharpest mouth in the territory," Jackson chuckled. "She said you wouldn't waste them. Then she's not wrong." They ate by lantern light, the children tucked in early. When the fire burned down and the night had settled its weight across the roof, Winona sat with her knees drawn up under a quilt, her gaze fixed on the dying coals. Jackson poured 2 fingers of rye into tin cups and handed her one. "Hard day?" he asked. She took it without speaking, sipped, then set the cup down. "I keep wondering how many more years I'll get with them." "With the children," she nodded. "They're not mine, I never forget that, but I want them to grow here. I want them to stop looking over their shoulders." "You think they still do?" "I see it in the way Emma flinches at loud doors, in the way Ellie checks the sky before stepping outside." Her voice caught slightly. "I want them to believe they're safe." Jackson leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Then we build that for them, not just a roof, a whole life." She turned to him, eyes shining in the low light. "And us, we build that too." She reached out slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. "You've been alone a long time. I didn't know how to be anything else." "You do now," she whispered. He drew her in, his hand sliding behind her neck, and kissed her without hesitation. It was quiet, sure, like the way sun warms soil after a long frost. Not a beginning, but a continuation of something already rooted. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, soft and constant. Inside, they held to each other like nothing else mattered, and truly nothing else did. The calf came just past midnight. Jackson had been dozing in the hay beside the heifer, his back against the stall wall, when he heard the shift in her breathing, a low, strained rhythm that pushed through the quiet like a warning. He stood, knees stiff, and leaned over the gate to check her. Her flanks heaved, breath steaming in the cold shed air, and the shine of hooves gleamed in the straw. Winona stepped in behind him, lantern held low. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, hair braided and tucked under a cap she'd sewn from a feed sack. "She started," Jackson said. Winona didn't waste time. She set the lantern on the ledge and crouched near the heifer's flank, eyes scanning the berth. "Position's good. We wait." Jackson nodded and settled beside her, the straw crackling beneath his boots. The heifer groaned once, long and guttural, and the calf slipped free with a wet thud. Winona moved fast, clearing the nostrils with a rag, rubbing the slick hide until the calf wheezed once, then again, then let out a thin, tremulous bleat. Jackson watched as the newborn lifted its head, legs folding beneath it like paper. Life, stubborn and loud, refusing to quit. "That's a heifer," Winona said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Strong little thing." He looked at her, not the calf, not the mother, but at the woman beside him, kneeling in hay, sleeves damp and eyes steady. "You're the reason she made it." Winona turned toward him. "You think I'd let anything die on my watch?" "No," he said, quiet. "I don't." They walked back to the cabin in silence. The moon hung low, and the snowmelt had turned the path into a slick ribbon of mud. Jackson held her elbow when she slipped once, and she didn't pull away. Inside, the stove had burned low but not out. Winona knelt and fed it pine knots while Jackson checked on the children. Ellie was sprawled across the mattress, one arm over his eyes. Emma slept curled beneath the quilt, her small hand clutched around the stem of a dried sprig she must have tucked into her pillow. Jackson returned to find Winona pouring water into a basin. She rinsed her hands, then dried them on the hem of her skirt. "You always knew what to do," he said. "I didn't." She dropped the cloth into the pail. "I watched, failed, remembered." That's all survival ever is. He stepped close, his voice low. "You think we're past surviving now, I think we're learning to live," she said. "One breath at a time." He touched her wrist, not to pull her near, but to feel the pulse there. "I want this to be more than shared winters and worn-out boots. I want to build something steady with you, not just for the children, for us." Winona's eyes searched his. "You sure now? Because I can't afford to be someone's almost." "You aren't," he said. "You're the only thing I've been sure of in years." She leaned in, forehead resting against his chest. "Then let's stop pretending we're anything but a family." The next day, Jackson rode to town 20 miles west along the river bend to register his land claim under both their names. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't speak, stamping the papers with a dull thud as Jackson slid the coins across the counter. When he returned at dusk, Winona was in the garden plot, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands deep in the thawed earth. Emma sat on the fence rail nearby, humming to herself while he chased a chicken with a length of twine. Jackson dismounted and walked to her, dust rising from his boots. "It's official," he said, holding out the folded parchment. Winona wiped her hands and took it. She didn't open it, just looked at him, then slid it into her apron. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why I did." That night they left the cabin door open while they ate, letting the air move through. The stew was simple, the bread stale on the edges, but no one complained. Emmer read aloud from the almanac while he practiced his letters with a stub of charcoal and a scrap of pine board. Winona sat beside Jackson on the bench, her thigh pressed against his, her voice soft as she corrected the boy's spelling. And when the children were asleep and the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Jackson took her hand beneath the quilt. "I never meant to marry," he said. She turned to face him, her voice steady. "You didn't. You just found someone worth staying warm for." He kissed her slow, no hurry, no need. Just the feel of her breath against his and the quiet promise that nothing would turn them cold again. The wind held the scent of turned earth now, rich and damp. By April's close, the creek swelled with meltwater and the cottonwood leaves shimmered like new coins in the breeze. Jackson had spent the morning repairing the east corner of the roof, where spring rains had found their way through the thatch. Now he sat on the porch steps, rubbing pitch from his palms with a strip of old linen. Winona came from the barn with a shallow bowl of milk, her apron hem wet and her hair unpinned. She looked over at him and paused. "You've got a splinter." Jackson held up his hand. Ruth bit back. She set the bowl down, took his hand, and picked the sliver free with the tip of a needle. He didn't flinch, just watched her work. "You've a calm touch," he said. "You're the third man I've pulled splinters from," she replied. "First two didn't sit as still." He reached for her wrist, holding it gently. "You ever think about staying married?" "Proper, I mean." Her eyes flicked to his, guarded. "That what you want?" "Not for show," he said. "Just for the knowing, so no one can say different." She studied him a long moment, then nodded. "Then you'll need to ask me." He stood slowly, brushed off his trousers and straightened his shoulders. "Winona Sutton, will you marry me?" A smile broke across her face, not coy, not uncertain, but deep and steady. "Yes, Jackson McAllister." "I will." They married in early May, under the cottonwoods near the creek. Clara Morse brought a flour cake sweetened with dried apples, and a neighbor preacher who rode circuit blessed them with a few quiet words and a clearing of his throat. Emma wore a crown of wild violets that Winona had woven herself, and Ellie carried a carved wooden box Jackson had made, offering it to the preacher with both hands. Inside were 2 rings plain brass, hammered smooth by Jackson over a long night at the forge. Winona wore no veil, just the same blue calico dress she'd mended twice since the cold broke. Her hair was braided down her back, and when Jackson looked at her, he felt the whole world steady beneath his boots. After the preacher rode off, Clara took the children home with her for the night. Illy protested, but Jackson leaned down and whispered something that made the boy nod solemnly and follow without fuss. When the wagon disappeared into the trees, Winona turned to him. "We've never had a night alone, you and me. We do now." They walked the fence line at dusk, the last light laying gold across the field. Frogs called from the water's edge and bats swept low over the pasture. When they came back to the cabin, Jackson lit the lantern and set it low, and they undressed without words, without haste. It was not the first time they'd touched, but it was the first time as husband and wife, and something in that made the moment feel both new and familiar, like returning home after a long road. She traced the scar on his shoulder, left from a stampeding steer years back, and he kissed the hollow beneath her collarbone. They moved together with quiet urgency, as though the night itself bore witness. After, she lay against him, bare skin warm beneath the quilt, and he kept one hand on the curve of her waist as if grounding himself to her presence. "I never thought I'd be anyone's wife," she said softly. He kissed her temple. "You're mine and I'm yours." The seasons turned. By midsummer, the garden was thick with squash and beans, and Emma carried wildflowers in her pockets. Illy took to sleeping in the loft above the barn on warm nights, claiming he wanted to hear the horses breathe. Jackson built a smokehouse behind the shed, and Winona taught Emma how to salt meat and dry herbs on planks in the sun. In late August, Jackson came in from the far pasture, sweat darkening his shirt, and found Winona bent over the basin, pale and still. She held the edge with one hand and pressed the other to her stomach. "You ill?" he asked, stepping to her side. She looked up, eyes wide. I think I'm carrying." He didn't speak, just reached for her hand, cradled it in both of his. "You sure?" he asked. "No," she whispered, "but I feel different, like something's changed inside." He helped her to the rocking chair, fetched her water, and knelt before her, his forehead against her knees. She stroked his hair, slow and steady. When it was confirmed 3 weeks later by an older woman healer Clara sent for, Jackson built a cradle. Not from a kit, not from a plan, just from wood and memory and the shape of his own hope. He sanded it smooth and carved a single word into the footboard: safe. The baby came in early spring, born as the snow melted from the high ridge. A boy, with Winona's mouth and Jackson's eyes. They named him Caleb, after no one in particular, just a name that felt honest. When Emma first held him, she whispered, "He smells like fresh bread." Illy rolled his eyes but didn't argue. That night, Jackson took Winona's hand as she lay nursing the boy, her hair damp from the effort. "You gave me more than I ever knew to want," he said. She looked at him, soft exhaustion in her gaze. "We gave it to each other." Years passed. The children grew straight and sure. Emma favored reading and could name every plant on the property by the time she was 12. Illy learned to shoe horses and shoot clean and true from the saddle. Caleb followed his father everywhere, trailing dust and questions like a second shadow. Winona kept the house and the orchard, and taught every one of them how to carry their own weight without losing their kindness. Jackson aged with quiet pride, his hands always working, his words always few but full. And in the evenings, when the chores were done and the sun slid behind the low hills, he and Winona sat on the porch with their fingers entwined, their silence comfortable, their love a thing not spoken but deeply, permanently known. They had chosen each other, again and again, through storms, through sweat, through every season, and they never once looked back.